What was supposed to be just another quiet drive home quickly turns into a nightmare when a racist sheriff decides to flex his power, targeting what he believes is just another helpless black woman. But what he doesn't know is that she is no ordinary woman. She's a retired Army general, trained for battle, and she won't be intimidated. What happens next is a chilling clash of power, prejudice, and an unwavering will to survive. A woman refusing to back down, no matter the cost. Will justice finally be served, or will corruption win again? Hold tight, because this story is about to take shocking, unexpected turns. And tell us, where are you listening from, and what time is it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. Evelyn Carter sat alone by the window, the soft glow of the fading light casting a calm shadow across her small, yet meticulously kept home. A cup of coffee, now lukewarm, rested in her hands, a silent testament to the hours of thoughts that had passed through her mind. Outside, the birds sang a melody of peace, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. Her life had been one of discipline, structure, and relentless service, a life spent in the chaos of military warfare. But now, in her retirement, it all felt foreign. The silence of the small town she had chosen to call home was deafening. The simplicity of her daily routine, morning walks, quiet coffee, was a sharp contrast to the intensity of her past. The medals on her wall were no longer just symbols of accomplishment. They were silent witnesses to the battles she had fought. Battles that had shaped her into a leader of extraordinary strength and respect. She had led troops through hostile terrain, made life-and-death decisions, and earned the reverence of those who served under her. But now, in this quiet town, none of that seemed to matter. A lifetime of proving herself, not for the validation of others, but to demand the respect she had always deserved. As a black woman, she had faced resistance at every turn, from fellow officers to superiors who doubted her every move. And yet, she had never faltered. She had carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth, knowing that in a world that often chose to see only what it wanted to, her battle was not just for recognition, it was for survival. Yet today, as she sat by that window, sipping her lukewarm coffee, she felt the weight of the past press heavily upon her. She had retired from the military, but could she ever truly retire from the fight for respect, for justice? In a town where tradition clung stubbornly to its roots, where change came like a whisper, Evelyn Carter knew that her battle was far from over. The world had changed around her, but the prejudices she had faced throughout her career still lingered. Today was supposed to be just another quiet day, but life, much like the battlefield, had a way of choosing its own course. She had planned to visit an old friend, a fellow veteran, and return home before nightfall. A simple drive. But the town and the world had other plans for her. A single encounter, a routine stop that would send ripples far beyond her quiet town, a confrontation that would ignite something she couldn't yet understand. Evelyn Carter, a retired general, a woman who had once commanded men in battle, was about to find herself in a new kind of war, one that would test everything she had fought for, everything she had lived for. This was no longer just about her quiet life in retirement. This was about the kind of legacy she would leave behind. Would she walk away quietly, or would she stand tall and fight once again? And so, as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Evelyn Carter, a woman of unshakable strength and resolve, was about to face a storm. A storm that would not only change her life, but could change the very town she called home. The question was, would the world listen? This wasn't her first time facing resistance throughout her military career, She had encountered skepticism from fellow officers, soldiers, and superiors who had doubted her capabilities, whether it was due to her being a woman, a black woman at that, or simply because she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that unsettled those who thrived on arrogance. She had spent a lifetime proving people wrong, not because she needed their validation, but because she refused to let them define her. Still, she wasn't naive. She knew that beyond the uniform, beyond the rank and respect, the world often chose to see only what it wanted to. And in a town like this, where change came slowly and tradition clung stubbornly to the fabric of everyday life, she knew that respect was not something freely given. It had to be earned or in some cases demanded. Today was supposed to be uneventful. Evelyn had planned to visit a fellow veteran, an old friend from her time stationed overseas, and then drive back home before nightfall. She had made this trip before, always taking the scenic route through town past the small diner, where the smell of fresh biscuits and coffee always lingered in the air, past the antique shops that seemed frozen in time, and through the quiet streets where neighbors still waved at each other out of habit, rather than genuine familiarity. She pulled on her lightweight jacket, grabbing her car keys from the hook by the door. Her vehicle, a sturdy but slightly worn SUV, was a reflection of her practical nature. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable. Much like the woman who drove it, the paint had faded in places, and the slight dent on the back bumper remained unfixed. Not out of neglect, but because she saw no need for vanity as she stepped out into the crisp morning air. The smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the distant scent of gasoline from a neighbor's lawnmower. She took a deep breath, adjusting her sunglasses as she unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. The familiar purr of the engine was a welcome sound. As she navigated the streets, she passed the town square, where a few early risers were already gathered outside the local coffee shop. Some glanced at her car as it rolled by, their gazes lingering just long enough to make it clear that they had noticed her. She had lived here for nearly 5 years now, but she still wasn't considered a local. To many, she was just the newcomer, the older black woman who kept to herself, who didn't engage in idle gossip or linger at the church socials, and in a town where everyone knew each other's business, that made her an enigma. She pulled into the parking lot of the small diner she frequented whenever she passed through. It wasn't anything fancy, but the coffee was decent, and the owner, a stout man named Walter, had always been polite enough. As she walked inside, the familiar sound of a bell chiming above the door signaled her arrival. A few patrons turned their heads briefly before returning to their conversations. She stepped up to the counter, giving Walter a nod. "Morning." "Walter, just a black coffee to go." He wiped his hands on his apron before reaching for a to-go cup. "Morning." "Miss Carter." Usual, she gave him a small smile. "You know me, no need to fix what isn't broken." Walter chuckled, pouring the coffee. "You know. Miss Carter, you ought to sit down and have a proper breakfast. One of these days. Ain't good to always be in a hurry." She took the cup from him, her fingers warming against the heat. "Maybe next time," she replied, though they both knew it was unlikely. As she turned to leave, she caught the sharp glance of a man sitting near the window. He was tall, his frame broad, with the weight of years spent carrying authority on his shoulders. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Sheriff Travis Langley. She had seen him before, though their interactions had been limited to polite nods and passing his eyes. However, carried something different today. It wasn't just curiosity, it was scrutiny. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his fingers tapping against his bicep as he watched her. Evelyn met his gaze evenly, neither confrontational nor deferential. She had encountered men like him before, men who believed that their authority was absolute, that their presence alone was enough to command obedience. She took a slow sip of her coffee before turning to push open the door, stepping back into the fresh air as she made her way to her car. She resisted the urge to glance back. She didn't need to. She could feel his eyes still on her as she pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road. She allowed herself a deep breath. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just another small-town sheriff doing what small-town sheriffs did, watching, assessing, ensuring that everything stayed within the boundaries of what he deemed acceptable, or maybe this was the beginning of something else. The road stretched ahead of her, lined with towering oaks that cast long shadows across the pavement. The hum of the tires against the asphalt was a steady rhythm, grounding her as she drove. But despite the peaceful surroundings, a familiar tension settled in her chest. She had felt this before the quiet, before the storm. And if there was one thing she had learned in her years of service, it was that storms had a way of finding you, whether you were ready or not. Evelyn Carter had barely driven 10 minutes from the diner when the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her rearview mirror. The sudden burst of color washed over the inside of her SUV, stark against the golden hues of the late afternoon sun. She sighed, already knowing what was about to happen. She signaled, slowed down, and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. Coming to a full stop, her pulse remained steady as she glanced at the side mirror, watching the patrol car stopped behind her. The engine hummed softly as she placed her car in park. The familiar tension settled into her muscles, not fear, but the quiet alertness that had never truly left her since her years in the military. She exhaled slowly, her movements deliberate as she reached for the glove compartment before she even opened it. She stopped shifting her hands back onto the wheel where they remained visible. That was the rule. Always keep your hands where they could be seen. The cruiser sat motionless for a few seconds before the driver's side door opened. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, his movements brisk and deliberate even before he approached her window. Evelyn could read the body language, the squared shoulders, the firm grip on his belt, the slow assessing scan of her vehicle. This was not a routine stop. This was something else. She inhaled deeply, willing patience into her bones. The officer approached the driver's side, his polished boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. As he reached her window, he knocked against the glass with the edge of his knuckle. 2 sharp taps. Evelyn rolled the window down halfway. "License and registration," he said without preamble. His voice was firm, tinged with something else. Authority laced with challenge. She kept her expression neutral. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer tilted his head slightly, as if surprised by the question. His eyes flicked to her car's interior before locking back onto her license and registration. He repeated. She didn't argue. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into the glove compartment and retrieving her paperwork. She held it out through the window, but instead of taking it immediately, he let his gaze linger on her face. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Evelyn remained still. "I don't believe I'm required to answer that." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You don't believe?" he echoed, as if testing her. She held his gaze without flinching. "Am I being detained, officer?" His fingers twitched slightly as he took the license from her hand, finally shifting his attention to the document. His smirk faded as he read the name. "You military?" he asked, glancing at her again. "Yes," she replied evenly. He gave a short, humorless chuckle. Thought so. He looked back down at the ID, then at her face. "Once more, step out of the vehicle." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "May I ask why?" "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated slower this time, emphasizing each word. She exhaled through her nose, feeling the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs. There was no valid reason for this escalation. None but experience had taught her that reason did not always matter. She unbuckled her seat, bell, and opened the door. Stepping onto the gravel shoulder, the officer took a half step back, scanning her again. Now that she was standing, she was nearly eye level with him, and she could see the flicker of reassessment in his gaze. He gestured toward the back of the car stand. Over there, she did as instructed, keeping her hands at her sides. Her posture straight, the officer walked a slow circle around her SUV, peering into the back windows. "This your car?" he asked. "Yes. Been driving through town long." Evelyn inhaled deep, her patience thinning. "I was just passing through," he hummed under his breath. "You don't see many folks like you around here." She arched a brow. "Folks like me," the smirk returned. "Barely there." "Military types," he amended though. They both knew that wasn't what he originally meant. Evelyn said nothing, her silence deliberate. The tension between them thickened, settling into the air like an unspoken challenge. Then something shifted. From the corner of her eye, she saw another vehicle slow down on the opposite side of the road. A woman had pulled out her phone, holding it up slightly. Though not overtly, the officer noticed his smirk vanished, replaced by something colder. He turned back to Evelyn. "You can go," he said abruptly, handing back her ID. She accepted it without comment, her movements as steady as they had been throughout the interaction. She climbed back into her car, closing the door with a controlled motion as she restarted the engine. She glanced into the side mirror, catching the officer watching her. She held his gaze through the reflection for just a second longer than necessary, before pulling back onto the road. The encounter was over, but the weight of it lingered. She could feel it in the tightness of her jaw, the slow burn in her chest. Naomi Davis had been driving back from an assignment. When she noticed the scene unfolding on the side of the road, she wasn't supposed to be working today. But as a journalist, she had learned that stories didn't wait for convenience. Something about the way the officer hovered near the driver's side window of the SUV sent a familiar unease. Rippling down her spine, she slowed down slightly, keeping her distance. But reaching for her phone, she had covered enough incidents to recognize when something was off the stance. The slight tilt forward, as if the officer was trying to assert dominance. The way his hand lingered near his holster. It all sent warning bells ringing in her head. She pulled over a few yards away, angling her phone to start. Recording the driver, an older black woman with short, neatly cropped hair, sat upright, hands visible on the steering wheel. Naomi couldn't hear what was being said, but she recognized the pattern, the officer issuing CT demands, the woman responding calmly but firmly. Naomi had seen this before, too many times. She adjusted her grip on her phone and started broadcasting. Live, the road remained mostly empty, except for a few cars speeding past. Drivers casting glances, but refusing to stop. People noticed, sure, but noticing and intervening were two different things. Naomi knew that her footage might be the only proof of what happened here. The woman in the SUV moved slowly, her posture deliberate. Naomi had covered enough police encounters to know that hesitation, however slight, could be used against a person. It didn't matter that she was following orders. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. If the officer wanted to escalate this, he could. Naomi's fingers tightened around her phone. She kept recording. The officer suddenly motioned for the woman to step out of the vehicle. Naomi's pulse spiked. This was where things could go south. The woman hesitated, not in fear, but as if she was assessing the situation in real time. Calculating, Naomi could see it in the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw set. She had seen this before. 2. Finally, the woman complied, opening the door and stepping out with slow, measured movements. The officer took a step back, one hand resting firmly on his belt. "Stay where you are." He ordered the woman, unfazed, nodded but didn't speak. Naomi zoomed in. The officer continued speaking, though Naomi couldn't make out the words. His tone, however, was unmistakable. Sharp, condescending, the kind that made it clear he was asserting power, not enforcing the law. Naomi had seen enough. She opened her car door and stepped out. She kept a safe distance, but she made sure the officer saw her. "Is there a problem?" "Officer." She called out, her voice steady. The officer snapped his gaze toward her, his expression immediately darkening. "This is police business, ma'am. Move along." Naomi didn't move. "I'm just observing," she said. Lifting her phone slightly, the officer's jaw tensed. "Turn that off," he said. Naomi shook her head. "It's a public road. I have the right to cord the woman standing next to the SUV." Still calm, finally spoke. "She's correct," she said evenly. "She's well within her rights." Naomi's grip tightened on her phone. The officer exhaled sharply, frustration evident. "Fine," he muttered, turning back to the woman. "Let's see some ID." The woman handed him a card. Without hesitation, the moment he glanced at it, Naomi saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Something changed. It was subtle. The slight shift in his stance, the way his grip tightened ever so slightly before he loosened it. Naomi wished she could see what was on that ID. The officer, suddenly less aggressive, cleared his throat. "Wait here." He turned and walked back to his patrol car. Naomi, sensing the shift in energy, stepped closer to the woman. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. The woman turned her G sharp but composed. "I'm fine." Naomi wasn't so sure. They waited. The officer took his time in his car, too long for what should have been a simple check. Naomi kept her phone pointed at him, unwavering. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them when he finally emerged. He no longer carried the same air of authority. He walked back toward them, stopping just short of the woman. "You're free to go," he said almost begrudgingly. The woman took her ID back without a word. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if he wanted to say something else. But he didn't. He turned, walked back to his cruiser, and drove off. Naomi let out a slow breath. The woman pocketed her ID, then turned to Naomi. "I appreciate you stopping," she said. Naomi studied her. "I had to," the woman nodded. "Once you didn't, but you did anyway." Naomi shrugged. "It's my job." The woman smiled faintly. "It's more than that." Naomi wanted to ask her name, but something told her the woman valued her privacies. Instead, she simply said, "Be safe." The woman gave a small nod before getting back into her SUV. Naomi watched as she drove away, the tension in her chest lingering. She looked down at her phone. The video was still recording. She stopped it, and then she uploaded it. Sheriff Travis Langley sat in his office, scrolling through his phone with a deepening scowl. The video had already amassed thousands of views, and the comments were ruthless people, calling for his resignation, demands for an investigation. Strangers analyzing his every move, his every word. He clenched his jaw, tossing the phone onto his desk. He hadn't done anything wrong. At least that's what he told himself. But the footage told a different story. A black woman, calm and compliant, facing an armed officer who had ordered her out of her car for no apparent reason. A bystander filming as Langley's authority unraveled in real time the moment. He read her ID the moment his demeanor changed, the way he had turned and walked away, rather than admit his mistake. The internet had already decided his fate. The pressure was mounting. Calls flooded into the station. Reporters were already stationed outside, and even the mayor had reached out, demanding a meeting. Travis had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, and not once had he ever felt like he had to explain himself like this. Not to the public, not to some strangers on the internet. His deputy, Charlie Brooks, knocked on the office door before stepping in. He held a tense expression, his fingers drumming against the file he carried. "Sheriff," he said, hesitating slightly. "It's bad," Langley grunted, leaning back in his chair. "How bad?" Brooks exhaled sharply, stepping forward to place the file on the desk. "They're calling for your badge." Langley scoffed. "Who's they?" Brooks didn't smile. "The town council, the mayor, people out there protesting." Langley's nostrils flared, protesting. Brooks nodded outside City Hall, and it's not just locals. Some civil rights organizations are involved. Now, news crews too. Langley cursed under his breath. Brooks shifted his weight, looking at his superior with careful neutrality. "Sheriff, we need to get ahead of this." Langley drummed his fingers against the armrest of his chair. "And do what apologize, roll over for them." Brooks hesitated. "You can't ignore this if you don't make a statement soon. The department's going to look even worse." Langley stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He was a big man, taller than most, and he had always relied on his presence to command respect, but he wasn't sure that was enough anymore. She had an attitude, he muttered mostly to himself. Brooks frowned, who Langley waved his hand. "That woman, the one in the video." Brooks stared at him. She was calm. Langley narrowed his eyes. "She was challenging me. She was asking questions." "Same thing," Brooks exhaled. Sheriff Langley held up a hand. "I know what you're going to say, and I don't want to hear it." Brooks fell silent. Langley turned toward the window, looking out at the small town he had spent his career protecting. He had always believed in law and order. He always believed that respect for authority was what kept everything together. And now, because of one woman, one viral moment, everything was unraveling. "She was military," Brooks said after a moment. "Did you know that?" Langley stiffened. "She outranked you." Brooks added his voice level. Langley's jaw clenched. Brooks sighed, running a hand over his face. "Sheriff, this isn't going away." Langley stayed silent. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter sat at her kitchen table staring at her phone. The video had reached national news. Naomi Davis, the journalist who had filmed it, had reached out earlier, asking if Evelyn wanted to make a statement. She hadn't decided yet. She had spent her life serving a country that now debated whether she had the right to drive down a road without being harassed. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her? Phone buzzed again, another missed call. She exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temple. Then she made her decision. She called Naomi back. The press conference was held the next day. Evelyn stood at the podium, her posture as straight as it had been in uniform. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded in front of her. Naomi stood off to the side. Recording, Evelyn took a deep breath. "I did not ask to be in this position." She began. "But now that I am, I will not remain silent." The crowd hushed. She looked out at the sea of faces, some sympathetic, some wary, some outright hostile. "I served my country for over 3 decades. She continued. "I have led men into battle. I have made life and death decisions. And yet none of that protected me from being treated as a suspect for simply existing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This is not about one officer," she said. "This is about a culture that allows those in power to act without accountability, a culture that assumes guilt before innocence, based on nothing more than skin color." She let the words settle. "I am not here to call for vengeance," she said. "I am here to call for change." Applause broke out. She stepped back from the microphone. The fight had only just begun. The town council met that evening. The mayor, Peter Reynolds, sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Langley sat stiffly, his badge still pinned to his chest. The meeting was open to the public. People lined the back wall, their expressions ranging from anger to anticipation. The mayor exhaled. Sheriff Langley, the council has reviewed the video. Langley's fingers tightened against the table. The mayor continued. Your actions have put this town in a difficult position. Langley scoffed with all due respect. Mr. Mayor, I did my job. A woman on the council, a school teacher spoke next. Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate. Langley looked at her sharply. I did not intimidate her. The teacher raised a brow. The video says otherwise. Langley's jaw tightened. The mayor sighed. Sheriff, this department cannot function under this level of scrutiny. Langley remained silent. The mayor looked at the others. Then he turned back to Langley. The council is recommending your resignation. Silence filled the room. Langley's breath came slow and heavy. You can't be serious. The mayor met his gaze. I am Langley stared at him, then slowly removed his badge. He set it on the table, and then he stood and walked out. By the next morning, the headlines had changed. Sheriff forced to resign after viral video. Former general calls for police reform. Activist journalist sparks national conversation. Evelyn turned off the television. She had not asked for this attention, but now that she had it, she would use it. She picked up her phone, and she started planning her next move. The video spread faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours, it had been shared by thousands, and within 48, it had reached national news. News anchors dissected every second of footage. Legal analysts debated the implications, and activists flooded social media with demands for accountability. Evelyn Carter found herself at the center of a conversation she hadn't intended to start. She had only wanted to get home that night. Now her name was trending. She turned off her phone and set it on the kitchen table. The sheer number of messages was overwhelming. Calls from old colleagues, emails from civil rights organizations, and even a few interview requests from national networks. She had spent years navigating military bureaucracy. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield she had prepared for. Meanwhile, the town was no longer quiet. Reporters camped outside City Hall, waiting for an official response. Protesters gathered in front of the police station, holding signs with phrases like, "Justice for all," and "End police abuse." The local government had no choice but to respond. The mayor scheduled a press conference trying to calm the storm before it spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, Sheriff Langley remained silent behind closed doors. Discussions took place. Some argued he should resign immediately. Others worried what it would mean for the department if he was forced out under public pressure inside his office. Langley paced his mind, racing. This wasn't just about the video. It was about the backlash, the calls from the town council, the messages from officers wondering if they'd be next. And Evelyn Carter. She wasn't just any woman. She was a retired general. Someone with power. Someone the media could rally around. Langley gritted his teeth. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers. At the same time, Naomi Davis, the journalist who had filmed the encounter, was watching events unfold from her apartment. She had been flooded with interview requests. Her footage had become the focal point of national discussions. She had expected backlash. Of course, angry messages from people accusing her of ruining a good cop's career. But the support far outweighed the hate. She knew she had captured something undeniable. Still, something didn't sit right. Naomi had covered too many stories, where public outrage faded after a few weeks, where promises were made, investigations were launched, but nothing really changed. She didn't want this to be one of those stories. She decided to call Evelyn. It took 3 tries before the retired general picked up Miss Carter. Naomi said, keeping her tone professional, "I wanted to check in." Evelyn exhaled on the other end of the line. "I imagine you've been busy." Naomi smiled slightly. "Not as busy as you." There was a pause. "I didn't ask for any of this," Evelyn admitted. "I know," Naomi said. "But you're here now." Another pause. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn finally asked Naomi, hesitated, then chose her words carefully. I don't think this should end with Langley resigning. Evelyn didn't respond right away. You were in the military, Naomi pressed. You understand systems, and right now, this system is broken. Evelyn rubbed her temple. I'm tired, I know, Naomi said gently. But if you speak out, people will listen. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Evelyn spoke. All right, she said. Let's make sure this means something. The next day, the town council held an emergency meeting. The pressure was unbearable. The video had not only embarrassed the sheriff's department, it had put the entire town under national scrutiny. The council members had received calls from state officials. The governor's office had even reached out by the time the meeting started. The room was packed. Local residents, activists, reporters. Evelyn sat near the front, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Langley sat a few seats away, his jaw tight. The mayor cleared his throat and began. We are here to discuss the events of this past week, including the viral video and the subsequent community response. Murmurs rippled through the audience. As of today, the mayor continued. Sheriff Langley has been placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. A mix of cheers and angry shouts erupted. Langley clenched his fists. Evelyn remained silent. The mayor raised a hand to quiet the room. Furthermore, we will be reviewing policies related to racial profiling and police accountability within our department. Naomi, standing in the back with her phone recording, exchanged a glance with Evelyn. This was progress, but not enough. Evelyn stood the room, hushed. I appreciate the council's response, she said, her voice steady. But policy reviews mean nothing without action. The mayor shifted uncomfortably. We are taking this matter very seriously. Evelyn cut him off. Then let's be clear about what needs to happen. She turned, slightly addressing the crowd. Now this isn't about one man, it's about a culture. A system that allows incidents like this to happen again and again. Heads nodded. I have spent my life serving this country, she continued, and I refuse to let that service mean nothing. So let's talk about real accountability. A beat of silence. Then applause. The mayor exhaled. What do you propose? Evelyn didn't hesitate. An independent oversight board, civilian involvement in police misconduct cases, mandatory de-escalation, and bias training. The mayor hesitated. Langley shook his head, said, "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. Evelyn turned to him. You have something to say? Sheriff Langley met her gaze. You're making it sound like I did something criminal. Evelyn's expression didn't change. If there hadn't been a camera, would we even be having this conversation? Langley's mouth opened, then closed. Evelyn turned back to the mayor. We need systemic change. The mayor nodded slowly. We'll discuss the proposals, he said. Evelyn held his gaze. See that you do by the end of the week. The new cycle had shifted. Sheriff Langley resigned. A new interim. Sheriff was appointed, and the town council agreed to form a civilian oversight committee. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Evelyn sat in her living room watching the news coverage. Her phone buzzed a message from Naomi. Thank you. Evelyn exhaled. She hadn't wanted this fight, but maybe it had found her for a reason. She turned off the TV. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The fallout from the sheriff's resignation was immediate. The town was divided. Some celebrated the decision as a long overdue step toward accountability, while others viewed it as a dangerous precedent. The local news stations interviewed residents, capturing the stark contrast in opinion. Ion's Evelyn Carter had spent the past few days watching from the sidelines, careful not to let herself get swept up in the chaos. But she knew that just because the sheriff had stepped down, the problem wasn't solved. The newly appointed interim sheriff, David Miller, had wasted no time in making promises. In his first press conference, he assured the community that the department would undergo a full review of policies and training. But words were just that, words. Evelyn had seen too many promises in her lifetime that amounted to nothing. Naomi Davis, the journalist who had filmed the incident, reached out again, asking for an interview. Evelyn hesitated, but eventually agreed. She knew that if the town was going to change, people had to keep paying attention. The interview took place at a local community center, away from the cameras of national news outlets. Naomi set up a single camera, and the two women sat across from each other in metal chairs. Naomi clicked on the recorder. "Evelyn, first of all, thank you for taking the time to speak with me." Evelyn nodded. "I appreciate you reaching out." Naomi leaned forward slightly. "The past few weeks have been intense. How have you been handling it?" Evelyn took a measured breath. "I've been through worse. But it's different being on this side of things in the military. I knew my enemy here." "It's harder to tell." Naomi frowned slightly. "Do you see this as a battle?" Evelyn tilted her head. "Not in the traditional sense, but change doesn't come without resistance. And there are people who don't want change." Naomi adjusted the camera angle, Sheriff Langley stepping down. "Do you see that as a victory?" Evelyn exhaled. "It's a step, but the problem is bigger than one man. This is about the culture of policing, about accountability. If Langley leaving means nothing changes, then it's not a victory." Naomi nodded. "You've called for an independent oversight board. Some people argue that it's unnecessary, that it undermines law enforcement. What do you say to them?" Evelyn's gaze was steady. "Accountability isn't an attack on good officers. It's a safeguard against bad ones. If someone's doing their job correctly, they shouldn't fear oversight." Naomi glanced at her notes. Some residents worry that this situation has made it harder for officers to do their jobs, that they'll hesitate in dangerous situations. Evelyn didn't miss a beat. Hesitation isn't the problem. The problem is officers who escalate when there's no threat. If a police officer can't do their job without resorting to intimidation, then they shouldn't be wearing a badge. There was a pause. Naomi nodded slowly. "What comes next for you?" Evelyn leaned back slightly. "That's the question, isn't it?" She glanced toward the window, where a group of young people had gathered outside the center, discussing something. Animatedly, I didn't ask to be in this fight. But now that I'm here, I'm not walking away. Naomi smiled. "So, this isn't the last we'll hear from you?" Evelyn chuckled. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The interview ended soon after, and within hours, clips from it were circulating online. The response was immediate. Some praised Evelyn for her candor, while others accused her of stirring the pot. But she wasn't concerned about public opinion. She was concerned about action. The town council scheduled a meeting to discuss police reform, and Evelyn was invited to speak. She had never considered herself a politician, but she knew how to command a room. When the day came, the council chamber was packed. She stepped up to the podium and adjusted the microphone. "I've heard a lot of arguments over the past few weeks." She began. "I've heard people say, this is an overreaction, that Sheriff Langley was just doing his job. That accountability is an attack on policing. Let's address that." The room was silent. "I spent over 30 years in the military," she continued. "And, do you know what? We had oversight, accountability consequences, and yet we still did our jobs." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. If a soldier under my command acted recklessly, if they endangered lives without cause, they faced consequences, because power without accountability leads to abuse. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. She let that settle before continuing. So when I hear that officers might hesitate to do their jobs because of oversight, I have to ask why. What is it that you're afraid of? Because if the fear is that someone will be held accountable for their actions, then the problem is an oversight. The problem is what's happening when no one's watching. The murmurs grew louder. Some people nodded, others crossed their arms. "We have an opportunity here," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "We can ignore what happened and pretend it was an isolated incident, or we can make sure this never happens again." She stepped back from the podium. The council voted later that night. The Independent Oversight Board was approved the next morning. Evelyn woke up to a flood of messages. Some were from people thanking her. Others were from people telling her to mind her own business. But one message stood out. It was from a young woman named Maya. "I saw your speech. I want to help. Where do I start?" Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "Let's talk." She had never intended to become an activist, but maybe that was what leadership looked like. Not seeking out the fight, but answering when called. As Evelyn Carter sat quietly on her porch, watching the last embers of sunlight vanish into the horizon, she reflected on how far she had come. The journey from a single, fateful night to becoming the face of a movement wasn't one she had sought, but it had found her. And now, there was no going back. Change, once thought to be a slow, patient force, had arrived with an unstoppable force, just as she had. "You've become the face of something bigger," Naomi had told her, and Evelyn realized that this was no longer just about her. It was about all those who had been silenced, all those whose stories were buried beneath layers of injustice. She had become the voice that refused to be drowned out. The world didn't always wait for us to be ready. Sometimes it simply demanded that we rise, even when we felt ill-prepared. But in that rise, Evelyn had found something deeper. She had found her own strength, not just as a soldier, but as a woman who would not be silent, even when the world tried to make her so. And as she stood before that room, her voice echoed, strong, unwavering, and full of purpose. "I didn't start this fight, but I'll be damned if I walk away from it." The applause that followed was not just for her. It was for every single person who had fought their own battles in the shadows, who had felt the sting of being unheard, unvalued. The applause was for the change that was no longer just a dream, but a living, breathing reality. Now, standing at the crossroads of uncertainty, Evelyn knew this. Her fight was far from over. The path ahead was uncharted, but in the quiet strength of her resolve, she understood that the journey was never about the destination. It was about the courage to continue, even when the world seemed to ask too much. Her message was simple, yet profound. True strength doesn't lie in avoiding battles. It lies in standing firm when the odds are stacked against you. The battle for justice, equality, and accountability was not a singular moment. It was a commitment to every person who believed that fairness should never be negotiable. Evelyn Carter may not have chosen this path, but she was walking it with the unyielding conviction of a leader who knew that silence would never be the answer. And for all of us, there lies a lesson in her journey. The power to create change does not fade with age. It evolves. It manifests in our words, in our actions, and in our ability to stand tall when the world demands that we bow down. So, when life places a challenge in front of you, remember this. Courage does not ask for permission. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to refuse to stay silent when the world needs your voice. If Evelyn's story touched you, if it ignited something inside of you, then don't just keep it to yourself. Subscribe and share this message with those who need to hear it. Because change starts with us, and together, our voices can light the way. Your voice matters. It always has.